You know, hearing only works so good.
Yes.
Well, I have two of them. Problem is, it's okay. My wife was trying to get us up online. So.
We're good.
Okay, we are?
Yep.
Okay. One of our biggest frustrations.
He's still.
Off somewhere gallivanting around.
Well, I asked Steve Sunday morning, I said, do you know where she is?
Okay, if I remember correctly, I'm trying to remember what she told me. I think she's babysitting down in Louisiana.
Oh, okay.
I think that's where she is.
But she was supposed to come back, Steve. Yeah, Sunday.
Well, she's babysitting in Louisiana, then she's with Stephanie because Austin was going out of town. She's just got a new nickname, Very Pathetic Julie. Very pathetic means constantly moving.
Okay.
Very pathetic Julie. Poor Steve's got a bad. So this is the last lesson. I was hoping to have the new one out for you, but something upchucked yesterday and he's here fixing it this morning. That's why we're getting a new one.
Oh.
It is reaching its age. 5 years is about enough on these, and what he told us is they stop making parts. After a little while, so he run out of parts. Well, we're waiting. I inquired this week, and he said maybe by the end of the week, next week. So I can't come too soon.
And the trees are gone.
Yes, yes. Morgan Tree Service.
How much was that?
Dear, he wrote a check.
$1,600 for 3 trees.
Well, 2 trees, and they trimmed off the one that is dead up there. So, but they took care of all of it, and there's still stumps there. That's fine. But you notice the stumps are flat now. It's definitely
Yeah. But if he wants to make it
yes.
confusion to the tree.
Yeah.
What is that under pasture?
Just
Put on there.
put down tree removal.
Yeah, nice.
Tree removal. So, okay. In our prayers this morning, let's remember Janelle Burr. Janelle and ladies, remember she was talking about her health issues last week. Turns out she has clogged carotid arteries. So she is undergoing a stent procedure today at the new heart hospital in Brighton. Okay, however, she's going to have another one done in a few weeks, and she's got a blockage in the heart that has to be looked at. So they did a arteriogram, and the heart doctor will take a look at that because she's been dealing with the surgeon up till now. So, but please remember, as she undergoes this procedure, they want to do the stent instead of the surgery because they have a procedure, and please do not tolerate me for mispronouncing this. Carotidectomy, I believe is what it's called, where they actually go in, lay it open, clean it, and then close it back up and take out all the plaque. I knew a gentleman that underwent that and lived many years afterwards. This is to prevent the stroke, because typically a ischemic stroke, which is when you lose blood, is because your carotid becomes clogged and you don't get good blood flow. But this, they believe, was causing some issues with her eyesight and that bad blood flow. So she's undergoing that today, talking to Gail, and she's up there with her. So But they're talking about her possibly going home tomorrow. I don't think so.
Well, we need to remember Gail too.
Yeah, this is tough on you.
Yeah.
Because, she lost her dad last year. She lost her husband earlier this year. And her mom and dad are all she's got left. So, please remember her, so. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, remember us as gathering your name, as we look at your word. Lord, as we hear about Paul preaching, remind us always of your word preached and shared with us. Lord, we're fallible human beings. We're not perfect. Help us to understand that the servants that serve us, that they are fallible and not perfect either. Lord, be with Gail this day and be with Janelle, be with the doctors and nurses that care for her, be with all that are with her during the surgery. We pray, dear Lord, that it goes well and that she well served by the work that they do. Be with us, strengthen us, and keep us in your name. Amen. I've got to thank my brother. I don't agree with some of the stuff, some of his Bible passages here. But he does write a good Bible study about the perils of preaching. We'll just put it that way. Those of us that undertake that profession undertake a difficult profession. And I say that because I have not mastered it after 40 years. It comes a little bit easier, but it's still not easy. You've got to get up there in front of people and talk, and hopefully they'll listen to what you have to tell them. It's not always easy. So, okay.
Sometimes when you reach on, you don't realize it, but it hits people where they need to hear.
I hope so. That's the whole point. I hope it does. Because some of the times I'm preaching to myself.
Pastor.
Yep.
But this is not too funny, but, you can always blow a trumpet or ring some bells up there, because sometimes our minds drift off. I
You're
mean,
not the only one. Yeah, well, understand, it deals with this first question. My wife will tell you, she'll be the first one to admit it, that I have a problem sitting still. If I sit still, I will nod off.
I gotta sleep too if I sit.
That's just the way that I am. She always gets on me because I'm fiddling, doing something while I'm sitting there. If I'm not doing that, I'm not gonna sleep. That's just my nature. My dad was that way. And of course, my mom had very sharp elbows. My wife's got sharp elbows, and I've told her more than once, even to herself. My youngest one had issues with that. She was constantly getting him and needling him with her elbows, years ago. And that may be one reason why he doesn't like church much nowadays. By the way, my daughter-in-law got her first check for being full-time with the church.
Oh.
We were very happy to hear this. And I'm glad they're being blessed. Hopefully sooner or later they can start paying their own health insurance. We're still paying for their health insurance. So we don't stop. Oh, and by the way, my wife and I both got our first Social Security checks. I have reached full retirement age according to Social Security, which was 66 and 4 months. He would have had to wait another 2 years to reach her full age, because she was 66 and 10 months. My poor brother is 66 and 8 months. My poor brother, my youngest brother, is 66 and 10 months.
Wow.
They're raising it to 67. If you're born in 1960 or later, it's 67. But from 52 to 59, it went up by 2 months every year. Started off in 66 and went up by 2 months. So.
Already counting.
Who?
Philip is already.
Oh.
counting.
He's 41 in his 50s.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I used to mom.
Tell him if he quits counting before he knows it, he'll be there.
Believe me, I know that. I know that.
I was.
So, I shared with the group, situations that cause me to sleep. It's like with driving, I don't mind driving. I just sometimes have issues, and My wife has to help me stay awake. When driving, it does get old after a while.
If I'm driving from here to Little Rock, coming back, that's when I'm really tired. I can drink or eat something on the way back.
My dad used to travel, remember the old plastic ice bins from the hotels? He would get an ice bin, fill it with ice, and have a washcloth with him, and keep it on the floor by his seat. And when he was driving, he occasionally would wipe his face with the cold water to keep him away. When we first moved down south from Indianapolis to Shreveport, my dad's National Guard unit was in Terre Haute, Indiana. Which is, for those of you in Philistine, it's right by the border, Indiana, Illinois, off of I-70. And this was in the early days of I-30 and I-55. Well, once a month, he would drive up there for National Guard because he was still in that unit. He couldn't find a place down south yet. And it was money. I mean, he made extra money. And so he would drive up Friday afternoon, get up there Friday night, stay in the motel, come home Sunday. Long drives, 10 to 12-hour drives. But my mom was never so happy when he found a unit down at Barksville Air Force Base. It was 5 miles from the house. But yeah, he used to drive back and forth. My mom would go with him every now and then. He went through 2 vehicles. And I don't know how many sets of tires. This was before radial tires became the norm. Remember the biased line tires? You got what, 12,000 miles out of them, if you were lucky? Huh?
That's all right.
Yeah, about 12,000. And what was the name of the Sears road handler? They were one of the first commercially non-branded radial tires, and he had a Pontiac Catalina. And once he got radials on that, he didn't change tires. They stayed on there and he didn't have to change tires all the time. But I still remember that car. That was the first one my dad got that had power disc brakes on the front. My mom just about put us through the dashboard a couple of times.
Did it have that old straight A engine in it?
Oh, no, it was a VA. It was the big, we started off with a 6-cylinder Fairlane. And then he went to the big VA Catalina, and then he went down to a 4-cylinder Pinto. Oh, we called it the baseball Pinto. It was the 74, which they had issues with. The first issue was the tires. Firestone 500 radials. Remember those? They were not round. Yeah, they would never stay around. He had so many replaced under warranty. Once he went to the Sears road handlers, that was it, no more. Then it had problems with the engine. When we were driving it, you'd stop at the gas station, fill the oil, check the gas. That got covered under warranty. Finally, the last thing was the stupid gas tank. Those were called the exploding Pintos. Had to have that done, so 3 strikes and you're out.
Till we start the lesson.
Yes. So we got number 1 and 2. Why do you sympathize? I sympathize with giving us very much. Explain how these other young folks were raised from the dead. Now, notice there's a few stories about people being raised from the dead. 1st and 2nd Kings. Who are we dealing with?
Elijah.
And Elisha. Okay, we deal with both of them. In the New Testament, who does it? Well, no, Jesus is one. Paul's not the other one. Peter. Okay, notice who we're dealing with here. Each of these instances are who? Servants of God. Elijah and Elisha are prophets. Okay, Monday, Thursday, when we talked about the cup in communion. What cup did Jesus use for communion? A common cup. The Elijah cup. There was always a cup kept on the table. Did the guy do that for your Seder? There was always a cup kept on the table For Elijah, no one would drink of it. God was returned, Elijah would come and drink that cup. So it was always a cup kept on the table filled that no one would drink. And we believe, I'm not going to say for sure, but we believe this is what Jesus picked up and then distributed. Because what was he telling them when he did that? Elijah and him was there. Correct. He was the Elijah. He was taking the place of Elijah, the one who was to come, the Messiah. In other words, he was the Messiah. So both Elijah and Elisha were Messiah-like figures in the Old Testament. They were not the Messiah, but they spoke God's word and they fulfilled what God called them to do. And therefore, God worked through them the ability to raise people from the dead. Of course, we know that Jesus did this numerous times in the Old Testament. The Luke one, Jairus, his daughter, and we see a couple of other instances where he does this. But the daughter is raised from the dead. By the way, they leave out a single part in here. What is the part that they leave out? The woman with the blood issue who touches his clothes. Okay, they leave that part out because it's not part of the story. But it's interesting, he's not in Judea or Galilee, he's in another area outside of that area, technically a non-Jewish area when he does this. And Jairus is not necessarily, he's a ruler of a synagogue, but he's not necessarily one of the Judeans. He's from outside that group. So it's quite interesting that happens. And then, of course, we have Tabitha, Dorcas, who Peter raising from the dead. And by the way, what are on the ladies group? Dorcas and her. What did she do? Yeah. So close enough to the board. She was, the idea was that he was a helper to those down and out in the area. Okay. So, okay. How would you describe Paul's preaching in 1 Corinthians 2:1-5?
Well, he admitted he wasn't an eloquent speaker and as forceful a speaker as he was, the Holy Spirit used him in a very special way.
Very much so. I still remember, we learned to start preaching in our fieldwork congregation seminary. We only have one course on preaching before we go out on vicarage. Okay, the Reformed seminaries spend a lot more time on rhetoric and preaching. The Catholic seminaries spend almost no time on it. We have 2 to 3 courses on it, that's it. And most of our learning to preach is actually at the congregation we're working with. And what I mean by field work is we're assigned to a local congregation. And we work under the pastor. He has us do this. He has us help with worship. Occasionally he might throw us a bone to preach. Or I taught confirmation class at Sunday school at mine. I was up in Litchfield, Illinois, 60 miles outside of St. Louis. But that's how we start. And for all the rhetoric I hear from the seminaries today, field work was hit and miss for a lot of guys. Some of the guys I field worked with maybe helped out with worship once a month. Hardly did any preaching, and depending on their big assignments, maybe once or twice a month. Okay, Mine changed my second year in that the pastor took a call and it was vacant my second year, my whole second year. So we had a retired minister from the Mid-South District, your old mission exec, Pastor Gracie, Everett Gracie, was the vacancy pastor because his daughter, who was probably about that big when you remember her, was a teacher at their school. So they called him. He was not doing anything in St. Louis. He was the vacancy pastor. And they had communion twice a month. And for midweek Advent and Lent, and some of the Sunday mornings, I and a fourth year seminarian who married a girl from the congregation filled in. So I got a lot of preaching in my second year, which was unusual. And then when I went on vicarage, I was on my own. My supervisor started off 90 miles away, and then was 300 miles away. So I did everything on my own. I got a lot of preaching in my third year, much more than many of my colleagues did. So we all had different experiences in learning how to preach. And by the way, you did take Tom too, but he got back from seminary. I mean, from vicarage. That's kind of strange. Okay. So, you know, he was not a learned preacher. By the way, if you're wondering why, rabbis were not preachers. Okay, understand that. Rabbis were not preachers. They were teachers. That was their main job, was to preach.
I think it also helps people realize that Paul had such a tremendous way of reaching people and talking to them. It helps me show that God uses, you don't have to be an eloquent speaker
Correct.
to be a preacher or anything, that God uses plain ordinary people.
If I was an eloquent guy, I'd be making all that money, right?
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
It brings me that he was well educated, he studied under Gamaliel.
Okay, remember, well-educated and being able to speak publicly are two different sets of skills.
And he's going into it, it doesn't mean not to be present together.
Well, you know, there are guys that can do that. One of the teachers at Fort Wayne was Dr. Gerhard Aho, a short little guy. He was a Finnish, from the Finnish church, and became a homiletics teacher at Fort Wayne in Springfield, actually. And he came up to St. Catherine's one time. And he was such a good preacher that someone could throw out a scripture passage to him, and then he would put together a 15-minute sermon on that within minutes. He was skilled, but he was unusually skilled that way. Not everyone could do that. I've seen many guys struggle putting together a good sermon, and for others, it's not that difficult. It's skill set, it's a different skill set. Really is. You know, you take a look at these guys on TV and their skill set is communication. Okay, they may not know the Bible, they may not be able to explain the Bible real well, but they can communicate. And they can raise money doing it. Okay, really interesting. Okay, but you know, theologians, I wouldn't put them in that rank. They're not theologians. One of the things our church tries to teach us is to be a theologian before we get into the pulpit. Then when we get into the pulpit, what we're sharing is what we believe. And that's very important to our church. If you listen to the prayers very often, they will talk about right doctrine, pure doctrine, and stuff like that. We have a mania. I don't know what you would call it, but we very often emphasize right doctrine in what we do. Even though we're not always right, we claim that we're right. It's a hang up that goes back to our formation. But instead of trying to communicate God's truth, we want to make sure we have right doctrine. And those, by the way, are not necessarily influenced either. Over the years, I found that out. So, okay, how would you contrast Paul's preaching with that of Apollos as described in Acts 18?
Oh, turn it down. Oh. Scripture and spoke with great fervor. He taught about Jesus accurately and spoke boldly.
Okay, boldly, accurately, firmness. Okay, then those are not words that Paul uses about himself. Okay, right. And Apollos was well respected as a preacher. Apollos, Barnabas, and Paul were some of the early outsiders to start taking a leadership role in the church in the way of preaching and communicating with people. Barnabas was the one that he had falling out. Okay, but yeah, Paul. And usually, by the way, the letters to Hebrews is usually sometimes attributed to Barnabas or Apollos, not Paul. Who's the most dynamic preacher you ever heard?
Walter A. Meyer was the
Senior,
yes.
yes. And by the way, if you ever listen to his recordings, he did not have a low-pitched voice.
No, he didn't. No, but you just knew he believed what he was preaching. And that made the difference.
Yes, and he took a few cues from Norman Vincent Peale, and he was one of the early pioneers of what was called radio ministry. And he was the one that helped start the Lutheran hour in preaching. Oswald, yes, Ozzy was around to listen to Oswald was from New York, by the way, but he didn't have a New York accent. He was an amazing man. I was told that he would take the Greek New Testament with him in the pulpit and do a running translation while he was preaching. He was just that talented. That's what made the Lutheran hour was men like Walter A. Meyer and Oswald. We have not, except for Dale Meyer, Dale, Ozzy, and Wham. By the way, they call him Wham Meyer, William A. Meyer. There was Wham and Wham Jr. Wham Jr. taught at the seminary. But those three individuals made the Lutheran hour what it is. Some of the other guys we had have not been nearly as dynamic. By the way, try to remember his name. Klaus. Yeah. He just recently passed. And I was sorry to see that. He was not a bad preacher either. He just had one of those. It's a style. It's a speaking style. It's being able to talk and relate to people on a very relatable way. And by the way, the high voice. It was said that George Patton had a high voice, and one of the ways to get the guy's attention was to use on the swear words he did. But they weren't listening to his voice, listening to what he said. That was why he and George C. Scott were exact opposite.
Billy Graham was one of the top people.
Well, on the reform side, definitely. But he was a reformed preacher. I mean, he was not bad, but he was reformed. Theology-wise, he was definitely reformed. There were differences. It's like I'm getting the Mayberry Bible study together Sunday mornings, and you're going to see a very reformed influence in there for some things that they say. And, we'll talk about it when we get to it. Still learns a lot from it, but they have a different way of looking at things than we would. Okay. Why was he dynamic? What makes him dynamic? Voice. Mannerisms. Relatability.
Well, the way he was so dynamic and everything he knew. We knew that he believed what he was preaching. And to me, that's what it's
Yeah.
all about. If a person is up there talking about something they don't believe in, you can tell.
Yeah.
Some people that believe stuff, but they can't express it either. I mean,
Well,
you have like the Oswald.
it takes a skill set to do
Really,
it.
really good at expressing themselves. They do believe it, you can tell it. But you can also
Yeah.
have someone that's great, but he believes what he's saying, so it's, it's great when they have someone that can really get all those things going in one.
But it
way.
takes a skill set, you gotta have that skill set to be able to do it. Okay, there's one have to be dynamic to be an effective preacher.
No,
No,
knowing Jesus and asking the Holy Spirit to lead you in
Yeah.
preaching. And
okay, give several reasons why they might have been to you.
it was dark, it was not.
It was, exactly, it was dark, it was night. We often forget how dark it would get at night. Especially if there's no moon out, or there's a late moonrise or whatever. It's very dark because you didn't have all the light that we have today. We often forget how much light we have. That was one of the things about traveling back and forth to the seminary at night, taking the back roads. I would be somewhere outside of Poplar Bluff. And I'm on that, back then it was two-lane highway. And I'm on that 2-lane highway going to St. Louis at night, and it's dark. No street lamps, no side lamps, all you got is your puny headlights, it's dark. And then up ahead in the road, you see this light Corona. Up there a ways, and you're sitting there going, what the heck? And finally you realize it's the next town you're trying to get to.
Well, they call it light pollution.
Yes. That is why they build so many of these big telescopes in the middle of nowhere where there's no one else around. So that there's no light pollution around. It is a huge, huge problem. Go out sometime at night and take a look at how it's light there is.
Well, look at the Milky Way.
Try.
It's a truck, but there, you can see it.
Yeah. The only time that we saw it was when we were out in the foodies. That's something about up north, the northern lights. That was, to see them is just awesome. One year in Wisconsin, we were able to see it. It's quite the thing. Okay. Ask your pastor for an explanation of Daniel's use the word and share with the group. Yeah. It's just reminiscent, actually, the candles we use are reminiscent of the candelabras that were used on the altars in the Jewish temple. That's where they come from. The seven candle is the menorah. Bill?
Methodist Church. The smoke from the candle goes to the prayers to heaven.
Well, that's also, that's from the Old Testament. Yeah, we've got a lot of explanations for everything, not necessarily what they're there for. In the old days, of course, the candles were for light. Okay, I mean, and in the temple, it was reminiscent of God being present with them. Because remember, when they left Sinai, when they left Egypt, how did God show them the way? Pillar of fire at night, column of smoke during the day. Exactly. And so these are all reminiscent of God's presence with us. And we still do that today. I mean, it can be as simple as just 2 candles. In Crosby, that's all they've got. They don't have candelabras. And some of my churches, they only lit those for communion. Otherwise, they didn't light it. So, we've got a lot of customs around them. But, part of it was, they were used for light. Sometimes something didn't light. Now, why are they worshiping at night?
Always leave it the next day. You want to tell them as much as you can.
Well, they could have done that during the day.
And he was going to be leaving the next day, and this was his opportunity to talk to priests.
Well, the other thing is,
People work during the day.
yes, we're used to Sundays being a non-day of work. That is relatively recent. Up until Paul's day, they worked. Okay, Saturday might be the day they would take off. In Jerusalem, of course, it was a boom, 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 boom. Friday would be the day of rest for Jews, Saturday for Muslims, and Sunday for Christians. I told you the old story about the McDonald's having all three working for them, that simple reason. Depending on which area of Israel you lived in, you might not get mail service on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, depending on whether it was Jewish, Muslim, or Christian. Because they all had their dog days. In Canada, when I lived up there, you had what was called the Lord's Day Act, which restricted even truck movement on Sunday. Unless it was perishable cargo, the truck could not be on the road on Sunday. That was to guarantee truckers a day off.
Do they still have that?
Don't know. Don't know. There's still Canada still has a lot more restrictions than we do. Understand they are capitalistic, but they're also socialistic in some respects. And the workers have a great many more protections up there than they do down here. You don't fire someone just for good, because they get workman's comp no matter what. You paid into it. Every worker pays it. I paid into it when I was up there. It was required. Okay, what words, whose words was Paul reflecting when he told the congregation, don't be alarmed?
Jesus.
Well, not just Jesus,
That is,
Thank you, not.
yeah, angels, and we've discussed this before, you know, why?
Because, an angel appearing before you, I don't know where, middle of the night. Yeah, you.
How many of you ever watched the movie The Abyss? It's a 30-year-old movie. I love the movie. If you remember, what is the reaction of people when they see those water things? Same thing. Same thing, they're scared. They don't know what to do because it's something outside of their recognition area, something they're not used to. So yeah, it makes perfect sense, okay? Why does Paul say it? I'm sure you can look at that. I can do that. Well, I'm just asking, well, because remember what's happened. Eutychus has fallen, he's died. What does Paul do? Well, he picks him up. He picks him up. Then remember, in the Jewish religion, what did you not do? You didn't play with dead bodies. So he's telling not only you this, but also the people around him, don't be alarmed. You know, everything's gonna be okay here. So why so many references to these words of comfort?
To remind us that God is in control, that we don't need to be afraid.
Right. You know, Psalm 23, right towards the end. Yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I will fear no evil. For thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. You know, God comforts us. He's with us. He protects us. He keeps us. And we like that. Okay, now. Which miracle of the Old Testament is New Testament is your favorite?
Jesus resurrection.
Jesus' resurrection, right? Because it reminds us that because he lives, we live also. Okay? And it's one of his many miracles that he performs. I think part of the problem we have today is that what are miracles today just don't seem to phase us as much as they did those people.
We haven't had it because we don't expect miracles.
But we get them all the time.
But yeah, we prayed for them and, yeah, they're happening all the time.
Well, something happened, very special happened to my wife this week. And it was like, God is with us and taking care of us all the time. And we know that it just happens sometimes so unexpectedly. And we're thankful for it, but we don't often realize it. Going to the doctor today, hearing aids, glasses, all these things, 500 years ago, you couldn't get. 500 years ago, you went deaf. What happened? You went deaf. Think about poor Johann Sebastian Bach. He went deaf.
And the timing, have you ever tried to get someplace and you're running late, but then when you got down the road, saw there was a wreck and thought there may be a reason.
Yes.
But, yeah.
Well,
I wasn't at that spot at that time.
when I was in East Texas, we had 2 ways we could come home. And I needed to go through Tyler, Texas to pick something up. So I took the long way home one Sunday and Donna had stayed home with the kids. And so I took the long way home, came home normally, and was home. And I guess probably about 10-20 minutes after I got home, the power went out. And literally, the power went out. And we turned on the transistor radio, or tornado had gone through and this and that. Well, the area I had just gone through, that was exactly where the tornado went over. And the reason our power went off was there was 200,000, 300,000 volt lines that from Henderson to Dallas that crossed the highway. The big derricks that hold the lines. It had wiped out the derricks and then went right across the highway. They literally had to drive telephone poles inside of the road and then tighten the lines on and tie them off. Because if you notice, those towers don't have any guidelines on. What's holding them up is the tension on the wires in between them. And so they tightened those lines so that the tower didn't fall over. It was, and there was a mobile home dealership on the inside. One was totally wiped out, nothing was left. The other one, the homes were rear. Literally, the one that had been here would go over here, and they said, look at them, they looked fine, but if you looked on the inside, they were. And the TV station had the AC units ripped off the top. It was just. But if I did it a half hour later. Okay, what is it? Okay, on what day did the early Christians worship, and what day do we call this?
From today of the week, and we call it Sunday.
We call it Sunday. By the way, where did we get the names for the weeks and the days? Correct. A lot of them are Norse. They're Norse. Or Thursday, Thor's Day. Okay. Stay with well, in German, Dienstag, okay, Montag, Dienstag, Mittwoch, Donnerstag, and Freitag, Samstag, and Dienstag, I believe, I can't remember. Yeah, I think it's Dienstag for Sunday, but Mittwoch, midweek. Okay, Donnerstag, Thunder. Okay, all these names, a lot of more mythological. Why did we work on first of the week? Jesus rose. Well, no. 7th day is Saturday. Okay, there are groups of people called Sabbatarians. We know them mainly as the Seventh-day Adventists. They will tell us that we are wrong to worship on Sunday because you must No, it's not work. You must worship on Saturday, because that is the Sabbath day. And, you know, according to the Jews, it is the Sabbath day. You don't worship on the Sabbath day. Well, all our attempts to try and change the name of Sunday to Sabbath day, you don't work real well, because it's Sunday. But it's the first day of the week, you rose to the first day of the week. It begins the week, not ends the week. Okay, there's a lot of reasons we do it, and not one of them is prescriptive. In other words, they do not tell us why we have to, we just do it.
Well, Jesus said, Sabbath is made for man.
Right, not man for the Sabbath. Paul is the one that says, don't discriminate against folks for their day of worship. And he left that perfectly open. It was an old hang up of the Jewish church that you do it on the Sabbath. There have been churches that do Wednesday worship, Thursday worship, Saturday worship, and there's nothing wrong with that. We came up with a tradition that it's Sunday. Okay, is there a commandment that tells us we must worship on Sunday? No.
Does that go back to Catholic theology?
Kind of, the early Christians did start it. They did start the Sunday idea of worship. The Catholics just ran with it and used it as their day of worship and kept it that way. The Reformed are the ones that made it mandatory.
I'm wondering if the Christian group wanted to divorce themselves away from the Jewish group.
That was part of it.
What the hell is that?
That was part of it. That was part of it, I'm sure. But how many of you remember the movie Chariots of Fire? Okay. What was the crux of that movie?
Oh, then you compete in the Olympics on Sunday.
Why?
Because they didn't do anything on Sunday.
And that is the hard reform idea. You don't do anything on Sunday. When I lived in Canada, on the Niagara Peninsula, a lot of Dutch folks who moved there from Holland, they would sell their farms for a lot of money and buy farms in Niagara for really cheap and do it. And a lot of them, a number of them started flower nurseries. They would put in greenhouses and raise flowers there. And a lot of them got into chickens. Let me explain. In Canada, chicken is a commodity and it's regulated, unlike down here. So that the chicken farmers would get a return on their investment fairly good. They were guaranteed a return on it. It's like dairy farmers. Dairy farmers up in Canada, to produce milk commercially, you had to have a quota. The quota could cost nowadays, I think, $500,000. That is the producer to guarantee you money for the milk that you produce up to a certain limit. You were limited on how much you could produce. And so the quota became more valuable than the farm. And that's how it worked. So a lot of them got involved in chicken, basically either, pullets, commercial chickens, or eggs. And we had a number of egg farms. And on Sunday mornings, they had to hire out folks to work in those egg barns because they could not work there. It was okay for someone who wasn't reformed working there, but they couldn't work there on Sunday morning. And some of my members worked there in full days, and they could buy full of eggs really cheap. They would be unfertilized, and they so. So they worked on Sunday. What day of the week is the Sabbath? Saturday. Okay. Actually, how did the Jews measure that? 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Correct. 6 p.m. Friday to 6 a.m. Saturday is the Sabbath. 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. My fault. 24, not 12. 6 p.m. Friday to 6 p.m. Saturday That's why when we say Jesus spent 3 days in the grave, we sit there, go, wait a minute, he was buried Friday, he got raised Sunday. How is that 3 days? Here's how it's 3 days. When was he buried? Before sundown Friday, day 1. 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. Saturday, day 2. He rose sometime Sunday morning, day 3. Okay, so when someone says, well, biblically, he didn't say it, then you don't understand how they're doing it, guys. You're not reading biblical things. It's like someone always comes up, well, the Gospels can't agree on what time is what, because one's using Roman time, one's using Jewish time. Come on, you fools. A lot of religious writers have no religious background. So therefore, they are unknowledgeable of these things. So they sometimes come up with really dumb stuff. Okay, what was the punishment for violating the Sabbath? Okay, why?
Dishonoring God.
Dishonoring God, yeah. Now, it says 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest. Sabbath of solemn rest. Notice how they put that, Sabbath. In other words, it is to be a day of rest. Why?
God,
He needs that regeneration.
Okay, Ms. Army?
God rested on the 7th day.
Yes, God rested. Wait a minute.
And the body needs it.
The body needs it. Okay, remember Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath was a day of rest for man, so that man could recuperate. He needs the time off. One of the problems that we have today is with our go-go 24 hours, 7 days a week, people aren't getting the rest that they need. Again, difference between Europe and the US. In Europe, it is mandatory you take your holidays. And how long do people get off in Europe? 4 weeks. 4 weeks. And every company gives their people 4 weeks. Not after 5 years, not after 10 years, not after 20 years, when you start to get 4 weeks. In the service, when you enlist in the service, how much time do you get? 30 days a year, starting from the time you start. You accumulate 2, 3, 24, 2.5 days a month in leave when you're in the service, automatically. That and I don't think that they did take that away from you, you being under punishment either, can they? No. They can take rank, they can take money, but they cannot take away your vacation in punitive punishment. I mean, that's how much they cherish that. And by the way, they're forcing the guys to use it now too. You can only keep it for like 2 years. That's it. Unless you're ETS it. In other words, getting out, then you're allowed to accumulate a little bit longer. My brother retired in 2009. His last day of official service was August 30th or 31st. Can't remember. August is how many days? 31. His official last day was August the 31st. He was off from April till August.
Well, in the 70s, it was in the late 70s that they used to have a law that people didn't work on Sunday. Only thing, the gas station, the grocery store, in the late 70s, they done away with that, then people started opening.
They called them blue laws. Yes, I remember working at Albertsons Sunday afternoon after church, bagging. And someone would call, could manager come forward, please? And manager, they would have, some days, one manager worked a half day, the other worked another half day. He would be called up front. Next thing you know, he's making a phone call, calling the other manager to come in early because he's just been arrested. Someone bought something under the blue law they weren't supposed to. I mean, we would put tape up and everything. The problem is that the checkers were supposed to know this. And by the way, this was before the automatic checkouts. When everything was still manual. And so we had 16-year-old checkers. They didn't know. And so they would check the guy out and say, "I should bet, could you call the manager in the front booth?" And that was, they were enforcing it to force the government to change the law. That's what was going on. But yeah, I remember, how many, you guys didn't have brochures back then. But back in the 70s, there was a little sign in the front door about that big. I mean, the guys wore white shirts, black bow ties, daggers. And it was that big. It said, "Closed on Sunday, see you in church." That's what the sign said. And by the way, they didn't sell beer. Even though they could, they didn't sell beer. Because Old Man Brochures was bad. So, but yeah, I mean, we've come a long way. In some respects, not good. Okay. In businesses, force people to work. There is a case that don't look good. There is a case before the Supreme Court right now about a mailman who was a part-time, full-time sub that was being made to work on Sundays, even though he did not want to work on Sundays. He claims that he didn't need to, and they claim that he needed to, because he needed to go to work on Sundays. So we'll see what happens on that one. But yeah, it's become very contentious nowadays. I mean, I've had to work on Sundays when I was not in the parish. I had to drill on Sundays when I had to guard.
You work every Sunday night.
I still work every Sunday. I get 2 weeks, I've taken 2 weeks off in June, guys. Taking 2 weeks off in June, and we're really looking forward to this. But yeah, I know, I have to argue, excuse me, let me put it this way. I have to really push my sister out of the living room on Sunday afternoons. Especially if I'm going down to cross it, because I like to go in there, kick back on my love seat that we bought so I could do it, and just have the TV on low, and just get an hour cat nap in before I head down to cross. And you keep the power to go through again. But yeah, some jobs you have to. I mean, think about the poor police and firemen and all that fun stuff. Yeah, I'm sure there were many Sundays that Jerry had to work. And he wasn't home. Yeah. It's not easy to do that. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry, you were talking about your husband. One of my members worked for the county sheriff. And he said he absolutely hated working holidays. Because it mostly was domestic instances, and it was families that couldn't get along, and they were complaining about custody arrangements. I can't have my kid on Sunday, I want my kid. Or they had the kids, and they were supposed to bring them back, and they didn't, and they called the police. It's not an easy job, they get involved in situations they shouldn't have to. But my wife's niece is going through that one right now, so. It's one of those things. Okay, then why was this not a problem for the early church?
They were free from human regulations.
We forget, and I know the Reformed Church forgets immensely. The law no longer applies. Why? Jesus fulfilled the law, right? He fulfilled the law. The law has been taken care of. Jesus did it. That doesn't mean we abandon the law, okay? Doesn't mean we abandon the law. But not only that, the interpretation that they were running in Paul's day was a Mishnah interpretation, which included 613 laws.
Well, we use it as the Ten Commandments as guidelines as to how God would want us to live our lives.
Correct. How we live with God and how we live with one another. We often forget the one another part. We get the stuff with God down, right? But it's the one another part we have a hard time with. As someone once said about the Lutheran Church, we've got this relationship real good. It's this one we've got issues with. And it's true. Really, truly, it is. It's difficult. You know, I was just reading about another shooting. Someone up in Northern California, basketball went to someone's yard. He shot a kid, the parents, I mean, what's going on? No, I can't understand this. Describe how the Corinthians merged the Lord's Supper with a banquet. Okay.
About the fact that they came and they started eating and then.
Okay.
When did they have it?
Yeah. We had one professor at Fort Wayne who claimed every time you read the term breaking of bread, they're celebrating communion. And some others say, "Whoa, slow down there." In Corinthians, it seems to have been blurred. Really, truly blurred. And you remember, Paul upbraids them a lot about what? How they're doing this. How they're going off in different areas and doing this separately from one another. And he upbraids them about this. Apparently, and this would be in keeping with how they would do things, they were having both a potluck and communion. Which, you know, when you remember that Passover is where we get communion from, makes perfect sense. It was a communal meal that would then transpire into communion. I can go through that every Sunday. You know, I don't have a problem with it, but you know, my diet won't allow me. Okay? But yeah, so apparently this was not that uncommon. And they were doing that with Paul in Troas. Now, I didn't get into that earlier. This is happening off in Troas. Now, if Troas sounds familiar to another city you're familiar with, Troy, there's a reason for that. It's not that far. It's close to Troy. And it was a community of Christians. Most likely they did this in a house. We have evidences of, and we have seen early church houses where they worship. The church down in Crosson is kind of a cross between a church house and a church, because most of the church houses were round. They had worship in the round. The altar area would be close to the middle. And the reason for that was that they would gather around it. Okay, they would gather around it.
That's an extreme.
Okay, the concept of our church nowadays being long with wings goes back to Roman architecture. Okay, and cathedrals in Rome, of course, are all designed that way. They're designed by the cross, like that. And that's where we get our. Come on in.
Maybe you think they're in the front.
I don't know if you realize there's a lot, or his hands can be full.
Okay. All right.
So they gathered around, and likely what they would do is that it would be just a big old potluck that they would celebrate. Because remember, these folks would be a little bit better off than the ones in Israel, because the food was a little bit easier to get here. But they most likely would be bringing dishes together, and this would be a big meal of the week for them that they would celebrate together. If you remember in Corinthians, why does he upgrade the folks? Because they're separating off. They're going off into little cliques to do this. They're not eating together. And if they close it out with communion, they were doing it separately. And what does God call us to do? In one. It's a communal meal. It's not separate. One of the things that started happening in the late 60s and early 70s was that pastors' conferences, different folks would not go to the meeting. Why? They didn't want to associate with people who were not in correct doctrinal agreement. I witnessed this down in the Southern District. Some folks would do this. It's offensive to me. It's offensive to me. If you don't need communion, So they need to be asked about you. Yeah. Okay, but typically we take, because it's a communal meal, we celebrate it together. Okay, we're not supposed to be celebrating it separately, so, you know. But yeah, they did do that, they celebrated it together. Differently. How might this explain the action of Christians in Acts 27 and 11?
Came together to break bread.
They came together to break bread, and as I said, the one professor at Fort Wayne claimed that this always meant they were doing communion. If you remember, I think it's this Sunday, when Jesus is walking with two gentlemen on the road to Emmaus, how does it end?
They recognized Jesus when he blessed the bread.
They're breaking bread together, exactly. When Jesus appears to the disciples in Galilee along the sea, when do they recognize Jesus? When he breaks the bread in that, right? Okay, again, it seems to intimate the possibility of the communion service or something similar taking place. I'm not sure that the theology of communion was as developed as ours was. So I think it's hard pressed to say every time in communion, but to them, it reminded them of what happened that night in the upper room.
That's sort of an old fashioned saying anyway, let's break bread together, or we're gonna eat, and that was not.
Well, I remember the song, let's break bread together on our knees. And we learned it when we were youth. Well, and if you remember back in the 50s, Miss Arlene, you'll remember this one really well, the mission festivals.
Yeah.
They were basically a big potluck after church, and then you set a big tent up outside, and you had a service in there.
But we didn't have to, we used Camp Go, and they had,
Okay, yeah.
they
Yeah.
had everything.
And I mean, they, you know, I had members that would complain, you're preaching too long. They have to remind them, guys, you don't remember the old mission fest, do you? I didn't have the heart to clean them all here. By the way, how long did Paul preach? All night long. He raised Eutychus, then went on preaching again. Yeah, till morning, it says till morning, till dawn. So he preached a long time. What?
Give that preacher, add him in the head, go
Yeah, to get going, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, if you could select one miracle which the Lord granted, what would it be? Peace on earth. What? Yeah. Yeah, yeah, as I said, I did. My wife and I do shake our head and see this stuff. I can't stand it. We know we're visited, but no one wants to do it. They're afraid of offending someone else. So, what? No. I know.
Hey, please get it, bread. There.
Well, let's break bread together.
Question, what are going to study the Bible class?
We're on the last two ones, we're gonna go to Mayberry, let's do one on Mayberry.
Is that really gonna be Bible study? Or-
Yeah. Yeah, we'll watch a part of Andy Griffith, and then we'll go over some questions. With Bible passages about a theme, you know. They're kind of interesting, right? Yeah, I'd like your perspective on some of the questions they ask. If you'll see what I'm talking about, it's maybe a little more.
But The person who's giving it didn't think it.
Well, there, I'm getting. We want it, and I, what?
It's and it's not like that other series where the guy really.
I'm hearing, you know, I do, all over these.
And how will that influence people outside? And listen to it, on Facebook or whatever.
Well, this one,
Don't make
nothing
it.
will offend them because I think the Eddie River.
No, I don't mean to offend them. Thank you.
Well, it brings up some good questions. It does. You know, the one is on service. How do we serve one another? Yes, ma'am. Yes, or not.
Mention.
That they're having a real issue. with that, and, governments have been. Yeah. And so, yes, the one has looking to do that. It's itself, the Russian war. See, we don't understand, and there's not one Orthodox church, there's many.
What?
And Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, Romanian Orthodox, all of these are separate. And they have separate metropolitans. And these elders get together and so